Good afternoon to all of you. Hope I can be heard well. So, greetings and welcome for the second high-level seminar organized by Central Bank Studies of Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Confronting the current foreign exchange crisis in Sri Lanka, lessons from the global experience, and that is our topic today. Central Bank Studies, as the human capital development arm of Central Bank, regularly conducts various public events, including expert panel discussions, high-level seminars, and public seminars throughout the year to increase awareness, to get discussions, and to bring in knowledge from various sources. And today's high-level seminar is another effort taken with the same set of objectives. Now, confronting the current foreign exchange crisis. Now, that is a topic which need no introduction as far as all of us are concerned. So, to discuss this matter with lessons from the past, we have invited an esteemed panel consisting of experienced economists in the region. So, without further ado, let's move towards the discussion, which would be moderated by Mr. A.M. Tasim, Assistant Governor of Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Mr. Tasim has been in the service of Central Bank for nearly 30 years and is currently the Assistant Governor supervising three key departments, namely Bank Supervision Department, Finance Department, and Foreign Remittances Facilitation Department. Prior to his appointment as Assistant Governor, he served as a Director of Bank Supervision for 4 years and was responsible for the regulation and supervision of the banking industry. He also served as a Director of Communication and also the Director of International Operations, where he was responsible for the management of foreign reserves of the country and managing the exchange rate. So with that introduction, let me hand over controls to Mr. Tasim. Sir, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Kushan, for that introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Let me once again welcome all of you for this webinar on a very important, relevant, and a timely topic. For me to quickly go through the agenda, today we will be having a keynote address by Dr. Diba Gurigundo, who is the former Deputy Governor of the Banco Central Filipinas, which is the Central Bank of Philippines, which will be followed by a panel discussion. And then it will be open up for, of course, the panel discussion will have 2 rounds of questions, where each panelist would answer for about 9 minutes maximum. Then we will be following up with the questions from the audience. So that will be the agenda in brief. And there are some housekeeping rules as well. Since this session will be live streamed by our Central Bank's official Facebook page simultaneously, the audience can engage with the panel discussion and present their question in 2 ways. Attendees who are joining through Zoom can send their question through the Q&A option in Zoom. Attendees who are joining through the official Facebook of Central Bank, they can submit their questions as a comment in the Facebook live post. So we will not be in a position to accommodate verbal questions in the best interest of time. So that will be the housekeeping rule. So going back, today we have with us a very eminent and distinguished panel who will share their insights, knowledge, and experience on this most important topic, confronting the current foreign exchange crisis in Sri Lanka, lessons from global experience. So let me quickly introduce the distinguished members of the panel. We have with us, as I said earlier, the keynote address, which will be delivered by Dr. Divasi Gurigundo, the former Deputy Governor of Central Bank of Philippines. Dr. Gurigundo retired in July 2019 from the BSP after serving it for 41 years, handling monetary policy and operations and other various aspects of central banking and macroeconomic policy. He was a former alternate director at the IMF in Washington, D.C. in 2001 to 2003 and was also the research head at the CSN Center in Kuala Lumpur in 1992 to 1994. He was at the forefront of regional financial integration for over 20 years. He served as the head of the technical group for the Chiang Mai Initiative in 2000-2001. He chaired the ASEAN +3 meetings of finance and central bank deputies at various points, including the ASEAN Senior Level Committee twice. Dr. Gurigundo also chaired the executive meetings of East Asia Pacific Central Bank's Monetary and Financial Stability Committee of Central Bank Deputies. Dr. Gurigundo graduated cum laude at the University of Philippines School of Economics. He completed his graduate studies in economics at the London School of Economics as a scholar of the Central Bank of Philippines. Dr. Gurigundo writes weekly columns for the Manila Bulletin and Business World. He's a member of the advisory panel of the Sim Kee Boon Institute of Financial Economics of Singapore Management University, an independent director of Philam Investment Management Corporation since October 2020. He's also an external advisor to Bain & Company with headquarters in Boston, Massachusetts, USA. Next member of the panel will be Dr. Mangal Goswami, Executive Director at the CSL Center. Dr. Mangal Goswami is currently the Executive Director at the CSL Center in Kuala Lumpur. He was the Deputy Director at IMF South Asia Regional Training and Technical Assistance Center in New Delhi. He also served as the Deputy Director of the IMF's Singapore Regional Training Center during June 2020 to December 2016. He has a range of experience with IMF macro and macro financial capacity development work in Asia. Prior to joining the STI, he was a senior economist in the Monetary and Capital Markets Department of IMF. Notably, he was a member of the selected IMF working groups during the global financial crisis. He participated in IMF's surveillance work on large complex financial institutions and was part of several financial sector assessment programs. Before joining the IMF, he was an economist at ABN AMRO Bank in Singapore during the Asian financial crisis, and he served in the research department of the Federal Reserve of Kansas City in the US. The next panelist would be Dr. Ganeshan Vignaraja. Dr. Vignaraja is a non-resident senior fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore and a senior research associate at the UK's Overseas Development Institute. Previously, he held senior roles in the UK and Asia, including Director of Research at the ADB Institute, advisor to the ADB's Chief Economist, Executive Director of Sri Lanka's Foreign Ministry's think tank, visiting scholar at IMF, and Global Head of Trade and Competitiveness at Maxwell Stamp PLC. He has published 20 books, including Connecting Asia and Pan-Asia Integration. Dr. Ganeshan has a DPhil in economics from the Oxford University. And finally, we have with us the panelist, Mr. Anand Jailat, the Assistant Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Mr. Jailat currently serves as an Assistant Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Areas under his purview covers foreign reserve management, monetary policy implementation, domestic banking operations, and financial consumer relations. He is a co-chair of National Certification Authorities Task Force established under the Digital Transaction Act of Sri Lanka and served as a chairman of the Sri Lanka Accounting and Auditing Standards Monitoring Board during the period 2017 to 2020. Mr. Jailan counts over 30 years of experience and served in a number of capacities from an auditor to a head of department prior to being appointed as an assistant governor of the bank. His experience covers the areas of monetary policy, foreign reserves management, risk management, fund investment management, financial regulation, economic research, and auditing. He holds position in a number of boards and has played different roles in several internal and external forums committees on finance, reserve management, securities financing, monetary policy, financial stability, risk management, payment system, regulation, and payment technology related fields. So those are the four eminent panelists which you just heard and which I just introduced. With that introduction, without much ado, I would like to invite Dr. Gunigundo to deliver the keynote address on the topic of today's topic of confronting the current foreign exchange crisis in Sri Lanka, lessons from global experience. Over to you, Dr. Gunigundo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tassim, for that kind introduction. And greetings to my fellow panelists this afternoon. And to everybody else, good afternoon. I would like to thank my good friend, Governor Nandalal Weerasinghe, for this opportunity to share some lessons in confronting foreign exchange crisis like what is haunting Sri Lanka today. I have been following Sri Lanka and Myanmar since 2001, when I was alternate executive director at the IMF until 2003. These two economies, plus my own country, the Philippines, were once described by an international financial institution as three of the most promising developing economies way back in the 1960s. Our population were mostly young people. Our level of literacy was high. Democracy was taking roots robustly. Of course, history tells us that aside from debilitating political strife, some racial, others ideological in origin, that emasculated the foundation for more sustainable and self-sustaining economic growth. Many of our economic policies were ill-advised and frankly rather narrow in scope and perspective. Growth, no matter how it was achieved, brought us some prosperity and peace, but only while it lasted, and that was rather short and patchy. Last week, Sri Lanka's own Prime Minister, Ranil Wickremesinghe, was quoted in CNN saying, "It's no easy task to revive a country with a completely collapsed economy, especially one that is dangerously low on foreign reserves. If steps had at least been taken to slow down the collapse of the economy at the beginning, we would not be facing this difficult situation today." This is very telling, I should say, one that seems any shred of hope could not be found, as we hear and watch people struggling with fuel, power, and food shortages. Paper for school exams ran short. Dollars, it was reported, were running out to pay for essential imports, including, as they were, food, medicine, and fuel. I'm not sure it's good to self-flagellate. It pains us to hear that because the economy is not doing well, the government has to implement a 4-day week for public servants to allow them to grow their own crops for food. Hundreds have been seen in film clips queuing to buy gas, travelers forced to squeeze into compartments, patients unable to seek hospital care due to fuel shortage. Food prices are skyrocketing. How long should our Sri Lankan friends endure this seemingly never-ending struggle? Some of whom who work in the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, and I know them very well, nearly 3 decades ago, were maimed because of one suicide bomber in a truckload of explosives, killing at least 60 and enduring more than 1,000 people. We all know that Sri Lanka sought an extended fund facility from the IMF way back in 2016 because of adverse impact of what may be described as inappropriate macroeconomic policies and difficult external environment. Even the fund admitted that some progress was made in monetary policy, fiscal consolidation, income tax reform, and automatic fuel pricing mechanism. However, it was so hamstrung during the program implementation because of a series of challenges, namely the drought in 2017, the political crisis in 2018, and the terrorist attack in 2019. Sri Lanka could not have been set back more sharply than by this trinity. The fund documented last year that while price movement was quite decently steady, growth significantly weakened. Gross international reserves declined with exchange rate pressure as a result of, among other things, large capital flight. What came next is something that we normally see in many developing and emerging markets. Large depreciation of the rupee in 2018, expansion in fiscal deficit, and sharp increases in interest rates. With weaker economy and low revenue mobilization, sustaining the level of public spending could only be made possible by incurring large borrowing. As a result, public debt to GDP ratio ballooned before the pandemic, and with limited resources and external trade not doing well either, these are sure ingredients to further foreign exchange difficulty. This could also impinge on fiscal and debt sustainability. Unfortunately, subsequent policy moves did not prove helpful. I have to say, ladies and gentlemen, that populism seemed to hold sway when both income tax and VAT were reduced at a time of serious fiscal challenge. It's imperative, yes, but it needs careful thought because it costs a lot. Some estimate put it at some 2% of GDP. This plus the COVID-19 impact on both revenues and expenditures of government brought the fiscal deficit to double-digit 12.8% in 2020 and 11.4% in 2021. This swelled public debt to exceed 100% of GDP. In short, giving something means taking it away from someone too. And this time, the government had to bear the burden, and that's going to be heavy. In addition, exemption from import duties of protective equipment, extensions of tax payment schedules, and other tax forbearance also undeniably strained the fiscal situation. And as expected, with weak prospects for growth, monetary policy evolved from the reduction in both the Central Bank of Sri Lanka's policy rate and required reserve ratio, leading to lowering of market rates and easy financial condition. Private credit expanded to double-digit growth through mortgage and consumer loans. The central bank was correct in stepping on the gas by partially reversing these policies, including the removal of the interest rate cap in the auction of government securities. It was also correct for CBSL to have also started to clean up its balance sheet and in the process help arrest demand pressure. Its previous move to help finance the budget could have been absolutely necessary given the pandemic and poor budget performance, but this move needed to be reversed at some point in the future to keep the credibility of monetary policy, and inflation rate is now rising to double digits. Of course, the imposition of price controls somewhat distorted the market because that should only result in speculative activities, hoarding, and supply shortages. Inflation will continue to rise. It has never worked except during national emergency, and it had to be time-bound. What about the exchange rate? I have always believed that fixing the exchange rate in the face of more volatile and uncertain economy may not always work. It may not be effective at all. Implementing a more flexible exchange rate is a more reasonable approach. It is a natural stabilizer because adjustment is driven by market forces. The CBSL chose to peg the Sri Lankan rupee with support from surrender requirements on FX receipts from both exports and remittances, direct sales for import requirements. The fund observed that these policies seem to have resulted in FX shortages due to hoarding, upsetting market clearing in both the spot and forward markets. No wonder the parallel market rates exceeded the official market by some double-digit margins. Automatic fuel pricing mechanism was concluded, and that was also quite tragic. Legislative plans to invest the central bank with greater independence, which is necessary, and fiscal rules to be more disciplined were suspended. We argue that these policy moves were populist in the sense that they were intended to achieve higher growth and more employment opportunities. And there's nothing patently wrong about that. But like all other populist policies, they were not sustainable. They were good while they lasted, and they did not last long. In the process, ladies and gentlemen, they brought Sri Lanka greater vulnerability to both domestic and external shocks and prevented policy reforms and institution building from taking stronger roots. It also shows that foreign exchange crisis simply reflects weaknesses in both the country's economic policies and the inhospitable external environment, including the latest pandemic challenge. In short, the foreign exchange crisis per se cannot be analyzed and mitigated in isolation from the rest of the economy's troubles. Appropriate policies need to have internal consistency because at this point, Sri Lanka's problems have become more interrelated, no less than a whole of economy approach is required. At this point, let me thank the staff of Governor Wirasinghe for providing me with the latest data sets and recent speeches of the governor to help me frame my modest assessment of what needs to be done in Sri Lanka. I say this in great modesty, ladies and gentlemen, because one, the Sri Lankan authorities are in a better position to understand the dynamics of the Sri Lankan economy, the situation and the prospects. And two, my contribution is simply to share our own experience in crisis management when we were faced with very, very similar macroeconomic imbalances in the early 1980s. I don't intend to take up a sweeping assessment of the tequila crisis in Mexico in 1994, East Asia in 1997-98, and Russia in 1998. With some differences in the global backdrop and country-specific challenges, the contours and dynamics are essentially similar as to causes and impact. I would rather focus on the specific experience of my country, the Philippines, in the 1970s and 1980s that most closely resembles what Sri Lanka is going through today. Crisis management, ladies and gentlemen, is aimed at restoring macroeconomic equilibrium or stability, as you will. As somebody once said, the secret of crisis management is not good versus bad. It's preventing the bad from getting worse. We went through from bad to worse, my country. But when we decided that enough was enough, we managed to reverse the situation for the sake of our country and our people, which is what Stephen Covey pointed out, that if we don't choose to do it leadership time upfront, you do it in crisis management time down the road. Today, we are no longer debtor to the IMF since 2006. We are lending to the fund in its various lending facilities to economically challenged, developing, emerging, and even advanced economies for nearly 15 years now. With 21 uninterrupted years of positive economic growth before the crisis, we managed to graduate from junk sovereign credit to investment grade for nearly 5 years now. Ladies and gentlemen, when the news of the Sri Lankan economic crisis hit the headlines in the Philippines last month, some of our market analysts and policymakers were rather quick to say that the Philippines is unlikely to face an economic crisis such as the one being experienced today by your country. The Philippines is in a different situation, that it is on the way to further growth and development, citing the 8.3% first quarter growth against the 7 to 8% official target. Our foreign reserves at 107.3 billion are higher than the stock of external debt of 106.4 billion, compared to what they quoted to be Sri Lanka's reserves of 1.7 billion against that stock of 7 billion. Such level of Philippine reserves stand today at nearly 10 months of imports of goods and payment of services and income, or 7 times our short-term debt based on original maturity and 5 times based on residual maturity. Our external debt, spread, and CDS spreads are even tighter than some A credit rating. We are at BBB+. But I have to tell you that once upon a time, nearly 50 years ago, we were in the same boat. We began the 1970s with debt rescheduling, supported by an IMF stabilization program. You know the drill. The commercial banks would not touch any developing or emerging market without an imprimatur from the fund. In our case, the sharp increases in commodity prices brought us some prosperity and bought for us the needed economic recovery, even as we were about to enter the first oil crisis of 1973-74. The pervasive consequences of the oil crisis triggered nationwide political protests and mass actions aggravated by the higher incidence of civil disorder and criminality. So what is happening in Sri Lanka today is not an isolated case. It happened before, it could happen today. The Marcos martial law government sustained its public spending on infrastructure despite the subsequent fall in commodity prices. And we were commodity exporters. This forced the hand of the government to rely on heavy foreign borrowing at the time that enormous petrodollars were recycled across the world's capital markets, giving rise to low interest rates. Because of our sad experience in having excessive external debt exposure, our central bank and the Department of Finance did manage our foreign debt reasonably well with limits set by Congress. While foreign direct investments were encouraged through various incentives like tax holidays and duty-free importation of capital goods for the first 2 years of operation, their role in development finance remained nominal compared to foreign loans. This situation was sustained far longer than expected because the economy was to increase its exports and GDP. Thus, our debt to GDP ratio was almost comparable to that of Korea, but lower than most Latin American counterparts. But the time of reckoning came after the second oil crisis of 1979 to 1980. Trying counter-cyclical moves, the Philippine government went into deeper external indebtedness. Fiscal deficit more than doubled, while the current account shortfall widened to nearly double-digit relative to gross output. The situation turned from bad to worse when foreign debt was incurred on increasingly shorter term. Even the old central bank expanded its borrowing significantly, and by offering swap arrangements, it even encouraged private banks to also increase their foreign exposure. With a rapid deterioration in its debt to output ratio, reaching more than 70% in 1983 and 80% in 1984, the Philippines declared a moratorium on its foreign debt in October 1983, with its foreign reserves almost exhausted to a few weeks equivalent of import requirements. There is no denying that the two oil crises of the 1970s, the decline in commodity prices and subsequent deterioration in its terms of trade, made the policy adjustments difficult for my country. But the policy choice of supporting public spending and growth through increased borrowing was not sustainable. It was bound to stretch its foreign reserves and cause rapid exchange rate depreciation. That is what actually happened in the 1980s in the Philippines that forced us to declare such unilateral moratorium, restructure our debt, and aim for debt to bond exchange. Most important, the Philippines failed to harness the increase in investment spending in bringing about higher output growth. The infrastructure, funded by higher investment and still higher foreign loans, had far longer gestation period with weak public goods component, as pointed out in the literature. These investments went to luxury hotels, cultural centers, and many pet projects of the government, which could only be described as frivolous. Some investments which started sour included those on copper refining, sugar mills, and the mothballed nuclear power plant. This failure to convert investment resources to capital stock could be seen more clearly in the high ICOR, or incremental capital output ratio, which shows big economic inefficiency. The reversal to higher interest rates in the 1980s further exacerbated the economic imbalance. Outside its dependence on foreign investments, the country also depended heavily on indirect taxes, on international trade with low elasticity. Most important, the revenue base was further eroded when the government decided to grant a wide range of incentives and exemptions rather than summon its political will to increase overall tax rates and strengthen tax collection. Tax policy constitutes the most direct way to make public spending to promote the people's welfare. Tax policy, short of that, would be palliative, short-term ineffectiveness, and essentially regressive. It is also important to note, while the Philippines started to liberalize the economy in the 1960s, depreciating the peso and dismantling import controls, it was not exactly aimed at nurturing more market forces for better resource allocation. Worse, traditional export commodities were imposed higher taxes. The protective system remained intact. Tariffs were instead raised. Manufactured exports did not surge as many would have expected. Rapid growth remained elusive for us. Finally, martial law regime gave birth to crony capitalism. Some favored families, friends, and cronies of the president were given undue advantage in the accumulation of wealth by appropriating state power. Such undue advantage took the form of public works contracts, government procurement, industrial incentives, and the so-called BS laws. Monopolies were formed in food marketing, fertilizer, labor export, gambling, sugar, and coconut. Graft and corruption became big enough to have macroeconomic consequences. They are not trivial. Economic distortions affected economic efficiency and resource allocation. Reducing, reducing the profitability of investment and magnifying the country's vulnerability to the onset of the financial crisis in the 1980s. Economic growth was stunted in my country. Poverty and inequality even worsened. Ladies and gentlemen, this brief narrative demonstrates the commonality of our experience nearly 50 years ago. What I could not forget about those tumultuous years was that coming back from London in 1984 for my graduate studies, I felt somewhat rich because I realized some savings from my modest student allowance. I left Manila 2 years earlier when the peso-dollar rate was around 9 pesos and 50 centavos. I returned when the peso-dollar rate hit 17 pesos and 60 centavos, nearly twice. However, my newfound prosperity was all in the mind because inflation climbed from 10% in 1982 to 50% in 1984. A bowl of beef noodles cost us only around 20 pesos or less than 40 cents US dollars. When I came back, I was horrified, paying more than 100 pesos or $2.50. With unemployment and underemployment reaching historic highs due to market interest reaching 50%, there was little incentive for investors to invest in production. They would rather live on the high interest on their money invested in government securities, as the government relied heavily on domestic borrowings too. Looking back at our experience, what is prominent is that when we attempted to tamper with market forces, economic policymaking ended up meaningless. The moratorium on foreign debt was the last resort. Our FX reserves were almost used up. We could not fund our imports and debt servicing. As a result, we reverted back to reactivate trade and exchange rate policies based on protectionism. Mandatory surrender of FX earning to the central bank, dollar rationing, trade duties were raised. Devaluation had to be resorted to for stabilization. What complicated the whole situation was that devaluation was accommodated by injecting more liquidity into the system via an increase in base money. What else could we expect but the resurgence of inflation, which peaked at 60% at the beginning of 1984? There was severe bleeding from state corporations, which relied on public subsidies and government guarantees of their debt. The new fund program rectified these wrong policies. By 1985, the Philippines settled all payment arrears with the IMF and the current account deficit eliminated. Inflation was arrested to low double digit until it finally came down to single digit. But of course, the real sector consequences were rather high. We sustained recession for some years. In short, we needed to establish some balance between the size and the timing of stabilization and its possible impact on real output and employment. Ladies and gentlemen, looking again at the numbers and charts provided to me and our own experience with managing similar crises in the 1980s, I would like to suggest the following. Number one, what is important at this point is to address Sri Lanka's very urgent liquidity needs. Market and creditor confidence should be maintained rather than be allowed to dissipate. For this to happen, the IMF support is crucial. What Sri Lanka should do is to demonstrate its political will to, one, use the proceeds of foreign loans and any form of swap facilities from other central banks to support only essential imports like fuel and food, as well as settle maturing obligations. Restructuring is critical because time is not on the side of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka's record of honoring its credit obligations should provide comfort to the international credit community. Perhaps the authorities could also do a debt exchange for bonds to lengthen maturities. Two, tax and trade policy should be considered within the context of a revenue-based fiscal consolidation. Fiscal discipline is key. At the same time, I share the view that tax policies drive equitable, more permanent fiscal strength. This is what we did after financial order was restored in the late 1980s through today. A series of tax reforms, especially during the pandemic, was mainstream. We hit fiscal and public debt sustainability only in 2005, after we hit a fiscal speed bump as we aim for higher growth rates. We realized the hard way we needed permanent resources to make growth sustainable and self-sustaining, while carefully managing the level and quality of borrowings. Gradual but consistent as we gain fiscal strength and the people get more confident with public policies. Public ownership is very important. I recall the previous generous concessions Sri Lanka grants to both individual and corporate income taxpayers. It's true we should all aim for lower income tax rates, but this ultimate goal should also be balanced against the requirements for public revenues. Government needs resources to service the people's needs. At this point, I believe our situation 50 years ago, as far as public debt is concerned, is no different from yours today. It is not sustainable. Whatever growth produces in the coming years may simply be dissipated by debt servicing. The original sin has to be addressed. Due to unsustainable debt situation, Sri Lanka's fiscal, monetary, and exchange rate policies only serve the cause of debt servicing. They are all subject to the demands of debt resolution. Sri Lanka may need to create fiscal space. Sri Lanka needs to allow the exchange rate to be more flexible, to allow it as an automatic stabilizer, even as its limits could be reached in today's more uncertain, more volatile, globalized world. This will allow the Central Bank of Sri Lanka greater policy independence and effectiveness to help stabilize the macroeconomy. I know CBSL would argue that keeping the exchange rate regime with some of the FX restrictions is time-bound. But ultimately, such a regime may not be sustainable. It may be costly. As a former central banker, I have to support my friend Governor Wirasinghe's desire for greater central bank independence. The literature is replete with the undeniable finding that where central banks are more independent, inflation is better managed. Tightening monetary policy at the time of national distress is challenging, but weighing it against runaway inflation should not make it challenging, should not make it difficult. Inflation eats away at the people's already limited earnings. High inflation countries cannot expect to attract quality investment and market support. Central bank independence also dictates the avoidance of direct loans to the government. Both the credibility and effectiveness of monetary policy might be compromised. I have also to agree with the Central Bank of Sri Lanka that it was spot on in ensuring financial sector stability. We started on the long journey of keeping the financial sector aligned with best practices and international standards in the late 1990s. One of the reasons the impact of the global financial crisis was rather muted in the Philippines was the resiliency, precisely, of the Philippine financial system, owing in turn to those reforms on capital, liquidity, market sensitivity, systemic importance, and financial reporting standards. We also have to set various monitoring systems and broad early warning systems. Take note, there are many black swans or even gray rhinos that do not lend them easily to this type of monitoring systems. Until today, the BSP continues to pursue regulatory enhancements the way CBSL continues to do. The financial system is the plumbing network of any fiscal and monetary initiatives to reach and influence the real sector of the economy. Finally, as our own experience would show, there is a great mileage out of promoting good governance and institution building. In the Philippines, it is estimated that we lose around 10 to 14 billion a year from corruption. That's around 0.2% of our national budget every year. Thus, the government should always strive for transparency and accountability in procurement and delivery of public service. This is a whole of government, whole of nation effort that should produce the greatest result in terms of inspiring confidence and trust in the government. This is the kind of commodity that cannot be expressed in dollars and cents. Governor Wirasinghe, thank you very much for this opportunity to think out loud and share our own painful experiences in managing economic crisis in our little archipelago across the Indian Ocean and the West Philippine Sea. Our experience differs by about 40 to 50 years, but I believe the lessons continue to be relevant. After all, as Paul Samuelson loved to say, what we know about the global financial crisis is that we don't know very much. I hope my remarks this afternoon somewhat reduced the things that we don't know so far. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Dr. Girigunda, for the very comprehensive assessment of the Sri Lanka's current crisis and sharing Philippines' experience of crisis management in a similar situation. I think you touched many areas which Sri Lanka could pick up. You addressed the importance of urgently addressing the liquidity needs of Sri Lanka. The need to go for IMF assistance is crucial. Sri Lanka needs to demonstrate its political will, and also you touched on the tax and trade policy, revenue-based consolidation, fiscal discipline, something that we need to adhere to. And also the sustainable debt, the flexible exchange rate policies, the central bank independence, and of course, keeping the financial sector aligned with the best international practices so that it will be resilient at a time, particularly at this crisis time. and finally the good governance, the need to eliminate corruption, and a call for transparency. So I think there are some good points that were raised by Dr. Girigundo. Thank you very much. And I think you have set the tone or the foundation for a very vibrant discussion today. So let me move on to the panel discussion. The Asian crisis of 1997 revealed the region's vulnerability to cross-border capital flows. A sudden outflow of foreign capital pushed the region's currencies into a downward spiral, leaving many borrowers insolvent. Now, that was a trigger point of the Asian crisis, but in Sri Lanka, it was not the case. So I would like to forward this question to Mr. Anand Jayalath, the Assistant Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. In your opinion, Mr. Jayalath, and of course you have first-hand information, what are the causes you see for the crisis in Sri Lanka? Do you think that certain causes could have been avoided?
Thank you, Mr. Tassim, for that very pertinent question. I think to start from where Dr. Girigundo referred, that is the original sins. And I think when you looked at Sri Lanka's current status, the current crisis, I think we can't forget the legacy that country is carrying. So when you looked at the post-independent economy, it has been always, except for very few years, a twin deficit country. Sri Lanka's current account was in deficit except for a few years during 1960s. The number of times the country approached IMF in its past history, particularly the post-independence, that shows that frequency of BOP challenges that it faced during the period. It was 16 times before the latest one. And together with this, it's 17 times. The country's trade account was continuously in deficit. Import expenditure was almost double the exports. In the current account, it showed some relief mainly because of worker remittances. But again, that was insufficient to cover the deficit. The majority of countries' foreign exchange inflows were not via non-debt creating flows like FDIs, but further borrowings. On top of this, its fiscal balance or the government budget was continuously in deficit and was increasing due to ever-expanding government sector. Even the country's primary balance, the government budget before the deduction of debt servicing expenses was in deficit, except for few years in its post-independent history. Government revenue as a percent of GDP was continuously on the decline since 1980s, except in 2015-16. Tax revenue was declining until 2015, but seen some increase by 2016-17, but the budget deficit rose significantly. And 2019, which was around 9.6%, increased to 11.1% in 2020 and 2021. So this twin deficit situation, the legacy that we carried, and according to both fiscal and BOP issues, were at the heart of Sri Lanka's macroeconomic performance continuously. In addition, heavy and continuing borrowings by the government to bridge this fiscal deficit over the years has made monetary policies and exchange rate management having limited effectiveness in managing fallout of funding the fiscal gap. However, subsequent to the global financial crisis, in the presence of low interest rate in the developed market, Sri Lanka shifted its strategy significantly towards foreign market borrowings, exposing the country towards global credit cycles. So although we witnessed rapid economic growth, majority of they were coming from borrowed funds, and at the same time invested in mostly non-tradable sectors or slow revenue generating sectors. This was reflected in the trade balance, and trade balance was not coming, but it was not very sound or deteriorating. The other factors, the change in the the composition of the debt, it was very rapid. And soon after we moved on to the commercial borrowings, particularly after the country lost its access to concessional borrowings, with its graduation to middle income country in early 2000, the most borrowings were commercial. We didn't have access to the low-cost borrowings from multilateral agencies. However, as the concessional loans declined, economy increasingly shifted towards commercial loans, mostly by way of ISBs and other bank borrowings, the overseas borrowings. While the domestic public debt levels remained mostly stable, foreign debt became primarily the force driving the Sri Lankan economy. Foreign debt to GDP ratio increased from 30% in 2014 to about 50% in 2021. Although Sri Lanka's foreign debt to GDP ratio has witnessed a significant reduction over the last 2 decades, the change in the structure and composition of high level of external debt has made economy more vulnerable to currency crisis in the last few years. And consequently, in 2021, economy had net repayments to foreign creditors. Therefore, entire budget deficit was financed by domestic sources. It's kind of domestication of external the obligations. And majority was financed by the sources like Central Bank of Sri Lanka or the monetary finance. Fiscal consolidation to revenue enhancement as well as expenditure rationalization, though become usual under such circumstances, such measures were hard to come by. Instead, the significant amount of monetary financing by the central bank has resulted in worsening inflation and exchange rate outcome. In this environment, the tax cuts that introduced in 2019-20 period and a reduction of VAT threshold was grievous policy error in my view. Total impact of such tax cuts was over 600 billion and some suggest it's 800 billion. And the revenue drop was about 7.7% of GDP. The mainstream economic theory suggests that such tax cuts could enhance money in circulation in the economy, in turn supporting economic growth in the medium to long term. Given the weak base in the country's economy, coupled with pandemic-induced additional expenses and limited resource mobilization had widened the fiscal deficit of Sri Lanka. When we move into external sector, tax cuts had then prevailed, low interest rate and the high liquidity environment create higher demand for imports. In addition, the pandemic applied brakes on tourism-related inflows of foreign exchange, which was 5th largest inflow that was normalizing after 2019 Easter Sunday attack. The pandemic-induced mobility restrictions around the world activated the remittances via banking channel and reverse decline in trend inflows. However, this was short-lived as with the increased immunization, when the globe moved into the mobility little by little, we saw that the remittance flows were changing. And this was supported by the fixation of the exchange rate at 200 levels. The tourism brought 4.4 billion and contributed 5.6% of GDP in 2019. And this was reduced to mere 0.8% in 2020 amidst the pandemic. On top of this, Sri Lankan government decided to ban completely the agrochemicals in April 2021 to mitigate the health impacts of chemical fertilizers and pesticides in farming and to promote eco-friendly, sustainable agricultural systems. Although the transition towards organic farming seemed like an environmentally friendly, sustainable step, sudden shift was like a time bomb waiting to explode. Whatever the rationale when organic farming was introduced in Sri Lanka, the sudden transition was extremely problematic due to lack of farming infrastructure, dependence on imported agrochemicals, lack of access to modern techniques and agricultural literacy. New methods of production were more costly with lower yields, and hence the agricultural policy was unprecedented in Sri Lankan history and resulted in serious downward adjustment in its harvest. For instance, the rice production quickly fell by 20%, leaving 33% agricultural land unused, increasing rice prices by almost 50% or more, the only seen in months. This disrupted the economy's self-sufficiency on rice production, and country has since had to import rice from overseas using scarce foreign exchange reserves. The industry, once a major commodity of exchange, incurred a loss of something like $425 million between June 2021 and April 2022, compared to that of February. As a result, nation's external economic performance deteriorated and its current account deficit increased from 1.14 billion in January 2022 from 0.13 in January 2021. As the mobility restrictions started to ease, increased immunization in the globe against the pandemic, economy started to work again. Growth was positive and increasing, creating employment opportunities or more on hiring for jobs. World has witnessed ease monetary conditions during the pandemic, started to move into tighter liquidity and monetary environment. This changed the incentive structure that previously encouraged developing countries like Sri Lanka of low-cost foreign borrowings. Capital flows commenced shifting, and together with Sri Lanka losing its ability to secure funds in the global market at comparatively lower rates. Hence, in short, I would say that serious policy errors in presence of legacy issues of significant and continuing macroeconomic imbalances, pandemic-induced damages, financial tightening around the world, particularly in developed markets, and resultant reversal of credit cycles, worldwide commodity price increase, and the war-induced scarcity all contributed to the current crisis in Sri Lanka. So I wouldn't say that it is different from the other crises that experienced, but everywhere there are ingredients of everything that we have seen, as Dr. Kunikindo mentioned, in the other crises that we experienced. Coming back to the next part of your question, whether certain causes could have been avoided, yes, of course. Country could have minded, I would say, economics over politics. If policies formulated via political consultation received proper attention, wider deliberations and analysis at subsequent but early stage, majority of errors that become disastrous could have been avoided. One instance is tax cuts. The next is country could have given high significance to the BOF issues that it was frequently encountering. Sri Lanka in the past attracted foreign capital not by way of FDI, but by way of borrowings or financial instruments. Such capital, however, resulted in the increase of disposable income of many, thereby increasing demand for imported goods. When countries' trade basket constitute more and more necessary commodities, it signals that the country is moving beyond its means, devastating current account balance, leading to BOP crisis. We could have read and understood those, and we read, but unfortunately didn't act on that. Delaying the approaching of IMF is another cause. So I would say. IMF is an institution created for assisting countries with external BOP issues. As experienced in the past, conditionalities could often be difficult to keep up with and could have negative impact on domestic economy. However, it's equally important to consider the pace and severity of economic crisis and the potential consequences. Therefore, Sri Lanka's early reluctance to seek IMF package any kind had arguably made things worse and reduced its options to avoid current meltdown. The next is applying the old personal financial wisdom that not to go on borrowing spree, even though you can, unless you know you can pay them comfortably with added revenue generated. Sri Lanka's habitual borrowing from creditor nations and multilateral organizations took a precarious turn when composition of its foreign debt structure started shifting towards commercial borrowings rather than concessionary borrowings. Not because the world is promoting some policies. The next important thing is the country need to look at sustainability of such policies, particularly given its macroeconomic context. So organic farming, moving into organic farming was one such instance. The policies such as shifting to organic farming might have needed more calibrated approach. The ad hoc approach have not only disrupted countries' resilience in some agricultural commodities, such as rice and tea, but also have rippled effect on other macroeconomic parameters. The low productivity and excess demand in the agricultural sector had to be satiated with imports of necessary food items. In the absence of sustainable forex reserves, this has led to a host of interlinked economic issues ranging from soaring inflation, currency depreciation. So I think all in all, there are many causes, and they could have been avoided if we acted on time in many. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jayalan. I think both internal and external factors have both affected the economy of Sri Lanka. And as you say, the delayed policy actions have contributed to deepen the crisis. Moving on, the currency crisis has now led to an economic crisis. The political uncertainty and social unrest are also becoming factors of concern. Some assistance from a few multilateral agencies have been extended, while IMF negotiations for BOP support is progressing. A few countries have extended their assistance with the essential supplies such as fuel, gas, food, medicine, and so on. But there are many more countries who could extend their helping hand to us, but they are not forthcoming. So I would like to pose this question to Dr. Vignaraja. In your view, Dr. Vignaraja, what could be the reason for this? Is it a moral hazard issue? Or how can we convince and gain their confidence?
Thank you, Chair. And it's a real pleasure to be at this Center for Banking Studies event with this distinguished panel and see such old friends like yourself and Assistant Governor Jayalat. I'm going to try to comment on this question by dealing with three topics briefly. Briefly where we are, and then talk about the role of various countries, and then what Sri Lanka needs to do to convince people that we are worthy. The first question on where we are, as you rightly said, Assistant Governor, this is the worst crisis that we have faced since our independence. And the risk I worry about most is of stagflation, that we can have negative growth with spiraling inflation and the added problem of unemployment and increased poverty. And that I think is a particular worry for myself and many others. And I think you're quite right that the causes include the shocks, which you identified very clearly. But there's also this kind of policy misstep, which I guess people put around this term homegrown solutions, right? And I think that is something we must keep in mind on an already weak economy. And I think that homegrown solution idea is something we should underline. And I hope we can come back to it in the conversation later on. Coming directly to other countries, apart from the IMF, we have gone to many countries looking for assistance. But we have seen a mixed response, Chair, as you well know. And I think this could be due to several reasons. The first is something like 60% of the world's poorest countries are also at risk of debt distress, right? So there are many others in this category, not quite defaulted, but in that category. Second important risk is we are at a risk of a geopolitical recession globally, and many countries, including countries from which we might want support, are also at some sort of risk. So people are naturally concerned about actually providing assistance to others. And there is multilateralism under stress. The third question really for me is something I hear a lot, is this question of why should other countries' taxpayer dollars be used to support a failed economy like Sri Lanka's? And it's a very difficult question because you have this argument that is made that in the eyes of some countries, Sri Lanka's debt default is seen as a homegrown crisis due to poor macroeconomic management and governance failings. And that is something that I've had thrown at me by people from other countries. Now, all of that said, India has been a special responder to Sri Lanka and a first responder. And India has provided us with something like an estimated $3.5 billion in bridging finance and aid under its neighborhood first policy. And interestingly, India is also a fairly small creditor to Sri Lanka. If I've got this right, external debt owing to India amounts to something like less than 1% or around 1% of Sri Lanka's GDP in 2021. Indian aid, I think, was motivated for different reasons. One was the humanitarian need to help the suffering people of Sri Lanka affected by shortages of fuel, food, and medicine. Then there were sort of internal pressures from South India to help the Sri Lankan people. And then there's a kind of a geostrategic issue for India that it's felt need to counter this kind of growing Chinese footprint in Sri Lanka. Now, my own sense is that, stabilizing Sri Lanka's economy could be a major win for Prime Minister Modi's neighborhood first policy. And India, I think, this is the largest program of bilateral assistance that India has given to any country, I believe, in recent times in this kind of rescue mode. And it kind of signals that India is kind of gaining ground, at least in the minds of Sri Lankan people, at the expense of China. But I feel that India could go big, really, much bigger, and lead a proposed aid consortium for Sri Lanka, providing maybe $20 to $25 billion over the next 3 years for Sri Lanka, in cooperation with the IMF and other friendly countries. And that would probably be the kind of money we need to put this economy on a decent footing and get growth going. And remember, that's about a quarter of our GDP, right? If we think of the equivalent, but we need that kind of money if we're really going to go forward. Now, for this is, not just for humanitarian and nice neighborhood policies. I think this could be good business for India, to be honest. Sri Lanka is main port gateway for India. Some 2/3 of the port traffic from Sri Lankan ports goes to India. And we could evolve from this kind of aid relationship to a trade and investment relationship. Now, ports will need to be connected better with Indian ports, and airports will need to be made better, perhaps through the north of Sri Lanka with the South Indian states. The Make in India program, which is very important, could have spillovers for regional supplies in Sri Lanka, for instance, in the car spare parts industry, which I think is important. And then there is this really interesting thing. Sri Lanka has graphite, as you know, Mr. Chair, very, very good graphite, I'm told. And, with battery technology being so important globally, I see no reason why an Indian investor couldn't, for instance, come in and make batteries here for electric cars, which I think would be very important. And, we would also have to think of an FTA to ensure rules-based trade, an upgraded FTA. Right? Now, while India's opportunity is there, and India as a first responder, China has faced a kind of a dilemma in bailing out Sri Lanka. Now, as we all know, China has been a major provider of commercial loans for Sri Lanka, sparking claims that Sri Lanka is in a Chinese debt trap due to borrowing for infrastructure projects. Now, when you look at the evidence of this, there is this kind of mixed portfolio of high and low return Chinese projects, some with environmental and social concerns. The external debt owed to China by Sri Lanka has trebled in recent years to what I make some 9% of GDP of Sri Lanka. Now, much bigger number than India, right, with 1% owing to India. But you notice that this capital market part and private creditors are really the major bit of the debt, right, because of the foreign borrowings through ISBs that Assistant Governor Jalat said. So the debt problem of Sri Lanka is not entirely made in China, but it's partly made, right? And China is there. Now, during high-level talks in January this year, Sri Lanka's president asked China for help to restructure our debt, right? And to give it concessional credit for imports, especially on the petroleum front. And I think there is a People's Bank of China swap arrangement that is under discussion to try to enable fuel imports from China. But China faces this big dilemma, doesn't it, at the moment? On the one hand, it doesn't want to lose friendship with Sri Lanka, nor the commercial opportunities. However, China worries that unilaterally restructuring Sri Lanka's debt or giving it moratoria will create a new precedent in its lending practices with other debt distressed countries. And there's a whole queue of countries, right, which are lining up to get assistance from China because of what is seen to be failed Belt and Road projects and excessive borrowing for such projects, right? Then there is a second problem. China, which is a G2 economy wanting to challenge the United States, right? It's this kind of ambition. It doesn't want to be hamstrung by the reputation of helping out a so-called failed economy. And that's a very important reputational issue for China. And then China is also facing a slowdown in its growth, it says, and with rising COVID cases. And with this, China has become more preoccupied for looking inward. So in summary, I think I agree with former Deputy Governor Ginigento that, the only solution to Sri Lanka's crisis at the moment is going for an IMF bailout and assistance from MDBs. But this will take some time, right? Bridging finance is also needed urgently from India, Japan, China, and Western countries to provide basic needs for the people, particularly fuel and food and medicine, but also to help stabilize the economy. To make this work, though, Sri Lanka needs to do 4 things. I think that's very important to show that we are serious about fixing our economy and convincing supportive countries and gaining their confidence. The first is we have to implement this IMF program in a transparent and credible manner. As you know, we've had 16 programs. I believe something like half of them have not been properly implemented and been abandoned. And I think this time round, we will be under the microscope. And I think that needs to be done. Second, we need to build a national consensus for this IMF program. There are still people out there who are going around saying, forget the IMF, we can grow batala kola in Matala or something like that. And, that's just not going to cut the mustard in Sri Lanka's current financial circumstances. So I think, those sort of people have to be called out. And we have to publicize progress on implementing the IMF program. The third thing we have to do is something, again, that the former Deputy Governor of the Philippines reminded us, that we have to ensure that any foreign aid we get, be it from India, be it from China, be it from the US, be it anywhere, is fairly distributed across the country to all the Sri Lankan people. And there is very, very strong crackdown on any kind of corruption of siphoning off this kind of aid. Because if there is such thing that takes place, we will condemn all of Sri Lanka to a terrible fate where countries will lose complete confidence in our ability to manage public services and ensure fair delivery. So we have to be absolutely on the money on this one. Anti-corruption has to be very, very strong. Any whiff of this would be terrible for Sri Lanka. And the last point is, I think we have to really become serious about foreign policy. We have dilly-dallied with, moving to China, moving somewhere else, etc. We have to pursue a very strictly non-aligned foreign and economic policy. And I think if we do these things, we have a fair sporting chance of getting a decent score on the board and turning our economy around with foreign assistance. Thank you so much, Mr. Tasnim.
Thank you, Dr. Vigaraj. I think you raised some concerns as well as some recommendations. Your concerns on stagflation and homegrown solutions, as well as you raised the question of where the 60% of the poorest countries would also be at risk, and the geopolitical recessions globally, and why should the other countries' taxpayers be bailing out the Sri Lankan economy, and so on, and also the Indian aid and India's business prospects amidst the crisis, and also the China's role in supporting a failed economy. And very well taken your points in relation to convincing the donor countries of implementing the IMF program, and also the national consensus for the IMF program, and also any foreign aid that we get should be distributed throughout the country, and of course the strict non-aligned foreign policy and foreign and economic policy. I think those are some important aspects that Dr. Vikramaja has shared with us. Moving on, there are complexities. You see when a currency crisis is coupled with a debt crisis and is compelled to opt for a debt restructuring program. Now, how can a country restore confidence in international financial markets after being defaulted? So I would like to pose this question to Dr. Mangal Goswami. And so the question is, how can a country restore confidence in international financial markets after being defaulted, and what lessons can be taken from global experience? Dr. Goswami.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to this panel. Thanks to Governor Veerasinghe and also to CBS Director Dimutu and to CBSL. It's nice to be with distinguished panelists as well. And again, very much a difficult circumstance being talking now. Sri Lanka is indeed facing a very difficult time, and feel very much for the Sri Lankan people, having worked closely with Sri Lanka, especially the central bank, and Sri Lanka being a very important part of the seasoned community. It is really heart-wrenching to see the situation, but I'm sure there is going to be a lot of movement towards the positive side going forward. With that, let me just provide you with my perspective as an international observer, with a caveat that this reflects my own views and not of any institutions that I represent. The complexities of the currency and the debt crisis is actually further amplified, as we heard before, by the confluence of large shocks that we are facing in the global economy, with high inflation, growth pressures, and tightening of financial conditions. So unfortunately, the tide that had lifted all boats post GFC has turned. And it's very difficult to be facing a crisis of confidence when the global economy in itself is suffering. So let me, put this into perspective by talking about how the large-scale policy support to stave off the COVID pandemic actually also further increased the debt buildup, not just in Sri Lanka, but in advanced economies, in emerging markets, and other frontier markets. Debt is global debt, government debt, even public sector debt has risen significantly. So as a sovereign that is dealing with impending debt crisis, the issue of restoring some semblance of macro stability has to first do with public policy, notably the financing of the fiscal gap, which is typically, as in this case, and in most cases, is rooted in sustained fiscal imbalances. And this was already, DG Gunigundu already talked about the imbalances in the economy and the growing imbalances. In this case, especially when domestic financing sources are limited, we know that for frontier economies and developing economies, domestic financial resources are limited with lower per capita GDP and lower private savings. And deploying the scarce private resources can lead to crowding out of private investments that is needed to spur growth. So it is a difficult situation. And we also know that resorting to monetary financing will likely lead to a decline in net foreign assets for given reserve money while stoking inflation. These are all established facts. but I'm just reinforcing them just to make the point that indeed to close this large fiscal financing gap, which is of immediate, which is the immediate issue given the debt crisis or the impending debt crisis, securing external financing is going to be critical. And for Sri Lanka and countries that are market access countries, there has to be clearly a very credible, cohesive, comprehensive medium-term reform strategy. Again, this strategy has to also be anchored in an immediate adjustment to put the debt and macro growth on a more sustainable path. We know from history that such adjustments are likely to be, cost have instilled some pain, and the transitional costs are going to be high. However, during this period, the period as DG Diwa pointed out as sort of managing this liquidity that the crisis, the first part of it, the short term and the immediate need will be possibly bridged through external official sector financing. Of course, such financing will come with adequate safeguards. To ensure that such financing creates a virtuous environment of balanced economic growth, it is necessary that the most important thing here is the debt overhang. The debt overhang has to be addressed to pave the way for spurring economic growth through investments. So how do we do that? First, there has to be a very credible case for debt restructuring that is grounded in the debt sustainability analysis, which also assesses what is the feasibility of policy adjustments and availability of financing. However, when such debt sustainability analysis shows that a sovereign, that the sovereign debt is unsustainable indeed, then just macro adjustments and fresh financing is not going to be enough, typically. You will need clearly debt restructuring to provide the much needed breathing room for the economy. Otherwise, previous lessons have shown that you're likely to go back to the same problem with imbalances resurfacing. Therefore, debt restructuring is critical. So on debt restructuring, on sovereign debt restructuring especially, I would like to highlight a few lessons that we have learned from history and from a lot of emerging market countries and frontier market countries that have gone through this. Clearly, we all know that this is not an easy exercise. It's a difficult exercise, and it needs to strike that balance between the creditor's demands and the debtor's constraints. That balance has to be struck. In terms of the actual debt restructuring, in the cases where such overhang is substantive, there has to be sufficient debt relief in the form of lower NPV of the debt outstanding to restore solvency. This is likely to require a combination of haircuts, possibly on the principal and coupon adjustments, along with maturity extensions that was earlier mentioned, to put the debt on sustainable path. This is the most important part, putting the debt on sustainable path to having some kind of a restructuring. These restructuring negotiations, what we have learned from lots of history is that it has to be done for it to be successful and for the debt restructuring to actually gain traction and to actually reduce the profile and to improve the profile of the debt going forward. You really need a transparent negotiation in good faith with support of the majority creditors. All the evidence indicates that information sharing and close consultation with the with the creditors go hand in hand with the quick and successful restructuring. Of course, here quick is relative. Information asymmetry is another very important thing to reduce this information asymmetry to ensure that there is transparency in the provision of data and on debt contracts. The other thing that is very important here is equitable approach. By ensuring that a fair burden sharing, and it will encourage creditors to come forth and to participate voluntarily in the debt resolution and to minimize any adverse impact from investor holdouts. On top of this, if these things, of course, these are difficult issues, but they are not out of the ordinary, and from lessons that we have learned, they can be achievable. And what we have seen in recent history is, in fact, such debt restructurings have the duration of that negotiation and finally, signing on the dotted line has sort of, that duration has sort of been shortened. For whatever reason, that's good news for Sri Lanka if this is all done in good faith, and a swift restructuring can therefore be achieved. If there are delays, this is a very clear message. If there are delays and there are prolonged, negotiations with, no end in sight, the economic distress can become very, very severe and very costly, leading to much bigger costs. That said, we know that over the past decade or so, in emerging market countries and in frontier market countries, the profile of debt has become much more complex. So this is not going to be an easy task. However, it is important that it is done in a way that is mutually agreeable. The other issue here that needs to be tackled, which history tells us, is that even if you were to focus on the external debt on this sovereign Eurobond or the likes, there is this knock-on effect on the domestic financial system. And restructuring the domestic financial sector may also be needed, whereby domestic banks, pension funds, and insurance companies are likely to be affected. So in that sense, there is also going to be some need for public resources, funds that need to be channeled to be it an asset management company to carve out the bad loans or the likes, or even to restructure the debt that is owed under the domestic law. So all this has to come in place. So it's a tall order, but at the same time, to regain the confidence of the market, to regain market access as a sovereign, these things have to be done. And the reputation of the sovereign will critically be dependent on how market perception and market confidence is restored as Sri Lanka continues to traverse this very long this journey. In terms of market confidence and return to access, what we have seen is that in such cases when markets are indeed they're satisfied with these kind of negotiations and outcomes, there is a high probability that private capital will return. And during that time, this is the second part of this, where you move from the short term to the more medium to long term structural reforms, where the investment climate, the regime for foreign direct investment, and all that, the more non-debt creating flows have to be attracted to spur growth. This sort of restructuring will form the baseline for the return of such capital, private capital. And what we have seen again from evidence of history is that there is going to be a need for fiscal consolidation, some kind of privatization or some kind of wealth taxation to raise the revenue, because this is fundamentally a fiscal issue in terms of the structural problem. However, Such confidence and private capital or return of private capital can indeed spur growth. And there is evidence that emerging market countries and frontier market countries have been able to reduce their debt stock relative to GDP by achieving higher growth rates than interest rates. There's also evidence that such restructuring are associated with notable drop in public debt to GDP, as well as even a stronger decline in the ratio of total external debt to GDP. So overall, macro conditions can improve, and in the similar vein, inflation pressures can then ease. But again, all of these will have to be, clearly balanced, and there has to be ongoing reform, and the momentum has to be significant for it to gain traction. That will put the sovereign on a more solid footing. International investors, I can tell you, I know a lot of people I talk to, they are always looking for ways to deploy their capital where risk-adjusted returns are reasonable. And we'll definitely be watching the progress on Sri Lanka with keen interest. I can also tell you that the international community has a soft spot for Sri Lanka because of its people, its diverse natural beauty and natural resources, the educated workforce, and of course, good cricket. So I think all of this lines up in a way that we can hope that we can achieve some short-term stabilization through some official sector help, along with debt restructuring, providing that platform for renewed growth. So let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Goswami. I think you raised some important aspects there where you touched on as you quite correctly said, the necessity of addressing the debt overhanging and for the credible debt restructuring program in a transparent and equitable manner. And also the need for restructuring the domestic financial infrastructure, which is also equally important. Thank you, Dr. Goswami. And moving on to our next panelist, Dr. Gunigundo, the Asian crisis of 1997 and 98, as well as many other previous crises, have been costly for the countries, both directly and indirectly. Obviously, in view of these costs, the foremost concern for policymakers and financial markets is how to identify the causes of crisis and prevent them. With your central banking experience and wide exposure, is there a set policy package that could be recommended for a country to prevent or rather be resilient to face and manage such crises effectively? Dr. Gunigundo.
Well, thank you very much. This is a very challenging question. And I would say no, there is no set policy package, whether at the IMF, the World Bank, and other international financial institutions. What is fundamental to me is a good examination of the current situation, diagnostics, if you will, of the macroeconomy, fiscal and monetary, the balance of payments, trade and payments, the currency, financial system, the real sector, even demographics or the policy framework. Some would argue that in the near future, even the economists at the area departments of the IMF might be replaced by robots and AI, and based on appropriate algorithms, they could come up with staff report and appraisal, similar to what they do with the annual Article 4 consultation. So my take, what do we put together as some kind of guideposts? Number one, the fund has stressed the importance of having standardized, comparable, timely data sets. We cannot overemphasize the analytical value of good, timely, and comparable data sets. This would give us the metaphorical results of our blood tests in those key areas of the economy. Second, research departments of both the central bank and the Treasury or the Ministry of Finance should have in their analytical toolkit such monitoring system like early warning system, leading, lagging, and coincident indicators for dashboard assessment. Consumer and business expectation survey. That's going to be very important and helpful as well. Purchasing managers' indices for monitoring industrial trends. Along the line, it would also be good to maintain measures of fiscal and debt sustainability, reserve adequacy, real exchange rate indices for external competitiveness. It is also advisable for countries to go through regular EPSAP assessments. And I'm sure Dr. Mangal, I think, has been a member of several EPSAPs in the past for financial system soundness. Of course, at the regulatory level, periodic and regular monitoring of banks' capital, asset, management, liquidity, sensitivity to risks is very crucial. All of these suggestions are meant for the policymakers to be forewarned of any forthcoming difficulty so that proper steps can be considered before the situation gets out of hand. Now, currency crisis is not an isolated crisis. It straddles fiscal, real, and external trade. What is important is to maintain liquidity in public finance. Agreement with the fund is critical in getting creditors to agree, not only for a lengthening of the maturities, but also restructuring to buy time for the economy to regain its footing in growth, inflation, FX reserves, and of course, the current account. We should not forget to establish and enhance social safety nets because economic crisis hit the poorest of the poor the most. What is the use of all these macroeconomic solutions if some of the most vulnerable are left behind? Market-based solutions with some scope for government action is preferred to administered solutions. Tax measures would always bring in permanent support to fiscal sustainability and strength. Direct subsidies on fully defined basis, time-bound and targeted is preferred than giving blanket subsidy. Removal or reduction of taxes that affect all types of consumers, those who can and cannot afford, should be studied very carefully because that is regressive. Greater flexibility in the exchange rate allows automatic stabilizers to kick in. Managed or administered currency arrangement, as I discussed in my keynote remarks, simply prolongs the adjustment and even magnifies the required size of the adjustment. International trade should be open to take advantage of the bigger market out there. If exports are limited, we would not have enough foreign exchange for our essential imports and debt payments to keep market confidence intact. We should also demonstrate our continuing commitment to pursue critical policy and structural reforms to keep the economy productive, efficient, and competitive. It will be good to also focus on good governance and anti-corruption initiatives to continue inspiring confidence and trust among investors. Yes, there is no one-size-fits-all, but economic history and analysis tell us these are the basic policy trends that could work during an economic crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Girigondo. I think you gave us the answer. There's no set policy package, but of course, the importance of having standardized, timely, comparable data sets along with maintaining liquidity in public finance and also enhancing social safety nets and also the greater flexibility in the exchange rate and international openness of the international trade and demonstrating our commitment for structural reforms and good governance. So there's a whole package of things that has to be done from the Sri Lankan context as well. Thank you, Dr. Girigondo. Now we move on to the second round of the panel discussion. I think our timing is going a bit, it has overshot. I think we have overshot the timing. So the next round, I request the panelists to confine their responses to 5 minutes. So moving on, I would move on to Mr. Jayalat, the Assistant Governor, Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Mr. Jayalat, what are the policy actions that have been taken by the Sri Lankan authorities so far to tackle the crisis, both in the short term and long term? And what are the realized outcomes and the expected outcomes? Mr. Jayalat?
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Hasim. So I think Sri Lanka, both Central Bank of Sri Lanka and the government has adopted quite a few number of measures I think they include the monetary. I think first one, what central bank has done is it has done significant monetary tightening, about 700 basis points at one stretch. And so it's a significant shock to the economy, but it was warranted because our interest rates were so low continuously. And at the same time, we had the cap on the treasury bill yields, and we have removed that and allowed that to determine on the market, by the market itself, demand and supply. The exchange rate was allowed to adjust freely, but unfortunately, no one could prevent the overshooting. So it has overshot significant level, and it was almost competitive depreciation. So then they consult the stakeholders, and everyone was looking for some guidance from the central bank. Unfortunately, central bank didn't have the reserves to intervene and get the things correct, put in the correct path. So central bank has changed its course and decided to provide guidance to the market, at least in the interim. So it was done with some reluctance, I would say. But initially, the exchange rate was the black market or the gray market rate was having significant disparity to the formal market rates, because everyone was moving there. Because central bank initially imposed cap on the exchange rate, that this level specified a level, though it's not by way of circular, some way or the moral suasion has allowed it to be there for a long time. As a result, the grey market spreads has significantly increased, but with the allowing it to float, this exchange rate was going at depreciating at a very rapid rate. So with the introduction of this market guidance, particularly in the absence of the competing forces, because it's a holders market, everyone who holds foreign currency wanted to have the highest rate. So we provided the interbank transacted rate as guidance, and we kept the ceiling and flow for any given day. With that, of course, little by little, exchange rate started to move with significant amount of discipline. Together with that, what we introduced is central bank introduced limitation on open accounts and DADP terms. The open accounts were the means of facilitating black market and continue to elevate the rates upward, so that with the limitation on the open accounts, the grey market spreads declined to significant levels, and it was almost in line with the formal or the banking market rates. So the seeking bridging finance from all possible sources, requesting friendly countries, the multilateral organizations, those to bridging finance by way of soft facilities, credit lines, and repurposing of funds assigned for other development projects to meet this crisis demand is done. And as a result, we received some amount of funds. Of course, I wouldn't say sufficient, but to navigate these difficult times, we received some amount of funds. At the same time, we didn't have way to pay the debt. First, we announced a debt standstill and straight away commenced debt restructuring by appointing legal and financial consultants, even before starting negotiation with IMF on the policy package. Reducing the monetary mandatory conversion requirement, that earlier there was a conversion requirement for export proceeds and worker remittances, up to 50%, those remitters and exporters had to money had to be converted by banks, and sent to the central bank. And that the amount that they need to send to the central bank reduced from 50% to 25%. Because we believe that we must allow market liquidity to increase and allow the banking system to manage this. However, we had the challenge that the central bank had the challenge of financing essentials continuously. And because the banking market was meeting its obligations that already created, and government has defaulted, and those things were coming in spiral to the banking system. So central bank has put its shoulders on the financing of the essentials. At the same time, supply of foreign exchange was continuing from the central bank angle to the essentials, not to the extent that really the country's demand meet the country's demand, but to the extent of the capacity of the central bank to finance this. Adopting host of measures in terms of utilization of buffers to limit spillover effects of the drastic monetary policy adjustment into the financial system. I think central bank has allowed financial institutions to utilize those buffers to the extent possible to meet these consequences of monetary adjustment that was significant. Monetary financing brought into the bare minimum, but still we couldn't stop it because government, though the government has reinstated the taxes to a significant level, there's a lag in receiving these flows. Even if these flows received, that is not sufficient to meet the obligations, not to any new imports, but to the existing obligations. So central bank had to continue with the financing, but we may be compelled to limit it soon as these obligations matured. At the same time, banking system was struggling to settle their liabilities. We have allowed banks to build up NOPs to meet the liabilities, to meet up with the cross defaults and the government defaults, so that the banks are little by little settling these liabilities. And we expect that this to be eased in at least to some extent in time to come in few months. The swaps and other credit card rate ceilings, things like those, were removed and allowed them to be determined in the market forces, by the market forces. At the same time, central bank increased its communication with the public, different other socio-political and gatherings, to create awareness among the public and policymakers, so that everyone will be brought under the same page. So the increased communication is expected to facilitate this, and advise the government and different other stakeholders in the measures that we need to increase foreign currency inflows to the country, exports, improving exports, and the commencing discussions on IMF package, with the government communicating with the IMF and requesting that assistance. And the discussions are progressing, and we expect that the staff level agreement will be finalized early. So that financing package, it will set the ground for the financing package in time to come. So advise the government on need to market-based fee pricing structures on SOEs, particularly power, fuel, things like those. And this has severe consequences on inflation, though they are one time. The inflation shot up, and together with the scarcity of products and restrictions created due to supply shortages in things like fuel, transport, and the same time, in the long term, the central bank advised the government on the structural reforms needed in the economy, and this is continuing, but it's time specifically as well. So those are the host of measures that, in brief, what we have adopted. At the same time, encourage, there were a number of rates applicable for remittance conversions, But with allowing the exchange rate to adjust to the market-based level, that we removed all those additional incentives, and now on the market rates, everyone can convert. So that's helpful in bringing down the gray market spreads and allowing it to happen slowly but steadily. But we do not plan to have these limitations in the exchange rate or the guidance in the exchange rate. They are more than necessary thing. But until such time, we may have to maintain that as well. So with that, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jainath. I hope those policy actions would contribute towards helping Sri Lanka steer out of this crisis. Thank you. We've already heard that the financial sector weaknesses too were the root cause of the Asian crisis, which required urgent attention. In a similar manner, the economic crisis in Sri Lanka also has a spillover effect on the financial sector of the country. So, Dr. Vignaraja, I would like to pose this question to you. How do you assess the necessity of developing structural adjustment programs for the financial system amidst a crisis like this? Dr. Vignaraja.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So it's very clear that an efficient financial system really is the cornerstone of a vibrant economy, as two of our guest overseas visitors have already told us. And, it's also very clear to me that during this kind of ongoing debt and economic crisis that we face, our bank-dominated financial system has come under a lot of stress. I recall that there are rising NPLs, there are rising debt levels, and limited financial adequacy. Overstretched state banks are a particular problem, and some finance companies are also under some stress. Now, in the worst case scenario, and I like to emphasize that this is the worst case scenario, it is possible that the debt crisis could spill over into a banking crisis, which would hamstrung the recovery and bring terrible social consequences for the people of Sri Lanka. And that's certainly something we desperately want to avoid. Now, of course, alongside the IMF program, we have to have comprehensive structural reform. So these are two things we have to do in parallel to some extent. And the key objective of these structural reforms should be really to create a deep and comprehensive and efficient financial system. And I think 6 things are very important that we should consider for these types of reforms. The first is immediately implementing an early warning system for the financial sector, right, which is bank dominated. So we should really have some good indicators. And I would be fascinated to hear from, the Deputy Governor, what sort of early warning indicators are important for us. Second, we should improve the resourcing of the central bank for stress testing of commercial banks and NBFIs, non-banking financial institutions. We have quite a good Department of Bank Supervision, I think, but I think we really have to upscale that so that it is very, very strong and with proper teeth to get the relevant data and to have the proper skilled manpower, because this is quite a complicated exercise. The third thing we need to do is to have really a mechanism for long-term development finance. By creating a kind of a new development bank, I believe, by merging the DFCC and the NDB. And the government has leverage because it has shareholdings in both. And this would create a better institution for financial inclusion with credit schemes for business startups, SMEs, women-headed entrepreneurs, and all those important social things we want to do when recovery comes. A fourth thing is I think we have to really enact bankruptcy law, like the Chapter 11 in the United States for non-financial firms. And I think that's very, very important. Otherwise, we can have this knock-on effect through our financial system if we're not careful, if final output producers go into bankruptcy and so on, and without the proper provisions. A fifth thing is really to accelerate the enactment of a new banking act, which I recall was under preparation by the central bank and others. I'm not sure where that is at, but I think that's a very important thing that has to be there. And then the sixth thing, I think, is we have to also introduce competition into the financial system by opening up to foreign banks and other financial institutions. And there are two advantages of competition. One is that it would spur efficiency gains and technology upgrading in the domestic banking sector. And second, it would encourage foreign investment in financial services in the port city, which we hope will be a game changer for service sector transformation in Sri Lanka. Remember, we have a lot of emphasis on this project, and we want to ensure that it doesn't become a white elephant project, right? And to do that, we really need to ensure that it can be free entry of foreign competition and foreign banks and foreign providers. And the seventh thing we need to try to do is to ensure that we have very, very strong anti-money laundering legislation. Because if we do not do this, Sri Lanka risks becoming a center for money laundering, and that's a terrible reputation to have in addition to the debt problem. And there are some countries in Latin America that have gone down that road, and I really would not advise us to do that. The last point I want to make is really a key lesson that we should take away from the Asian financial crisis of '96 and also the global financial crisis, is that we really need to have a strong macroeconomic and financial regulatory structure to reduce the economic costs of a crisis, right? A future crisis that we may face. And the central bank is very important in all of this because it's at the heart of our regulatory structure for the financial sector. But historically, I'm sorry to say this, but we've had a lack of autonomy, which means the central bank monetary policy and its exchange rate policy decisions were influenced by short-term political pressures. And I think, the different speakers have alluded to that. And I've seen that in sort of my own eyes in some way, having been on a committee in the central bank. In this regard, we have the governor who's appointed really by the president for a 6-year term. But the monetary board, which manages the central bank, includes the secretary of the treasury, right? So government indirectly has strong emphasis on this central bank and controls it. So another reform, and that's my 8th point, which I think is very important, is for the governor to be appointed in the future. And I do not mean the current circumstances at all. Current circumstances, we must keep the current governor, who's excellent, and I strongly support that he continues his role in an unhindered manner so that the country can get on a strong footing. But in the future, we may have a governor appointed by the president on the recommendation of a group of eminent persons, like a constitutional council without any parliamentarians. And I think that's the special point that I'd like to make, because there's too much disruption within the parliamentary coalition as they horse trade around appointing somebody like a governor. It's too important a position for Sri Lanka to forfeit. Second, the monetary board itself, I feel, should have the governor and a deputy, of course, but 3 independent members. And the Treasury Secretary, in my view, should not sit on the monetary board. And I think that these concrete steps would help towards meeting central bank independence and create a very strong macroeconomic and financial regulatory structure of Sri Lanka, which can also, blow the whistle in case we are heading towards a crisis. So I think we have to have a really important set of financial sector reforms, which should be thought through. And those first ideas I gave, I hope they're somewhat useful. Some of these things have been there. And then I think we also have to ensure that the central bank is made more independent in the course of time through the measures I suggested for the appointment of the governor, as well as also the monetary board. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Raja. I think you raised some pertinent points, and some of these are already being addressed at the central bank at the moment, especially in relation to legislations in relation to Banking Act, and also there's going to be a Central Banking Act as well. So this will also kind of strengthen the independence of the central bank as we go forward. Thank you, Dr. Raja. Now we move on to the role of the international community. Now, my question goes to Dr. Goswami. What is the role of the international community and the supranational institutions in addressing the foreign exchange crisis across countries as a part of global macroeconomic stability? Dr. Goswami?
Thank you. Thank you. I think I'll be very short because we have talked about this already in terms of how the role of the IMF and others are very important. It goes without saying that they have a very important role to play, especially in the case where the debt restructuring is concerned of emerging market economies in playing that important role where the creditors and the borrowers are brought together. Of course, in terms of enhancing or propounding some kind of a market-based approach to sovereign debt resolution or some kind of an architecture, this is where the role of the IFIs is very important. Strengthening the management, debt management through TA and the likes, reviewing debt limits, debt sustainability analysis. These are sort of very important issues. If you don't mind, I may just touch upon one issue that was raised in the Q&A, just to give. I'm not a lawyer, so and I don't want to comment specifically on that issue. This is about certain investors sort of either suing or holding out. What impact does it have in debt restructuring? So I would just say that clearly such precedents are there before. There is never 100% agreement on debt restructuring, and usually it's 90%. It could be 90%. There could be 10% holdouts or the likes. So it is not extraordinary to think of certain creditors being on the sidelines while the restructuring happens. But that should not stop the entire process of debt restructuring. And as long as the framework is there, the analysis is there, and what are the modalities of debt exchange and the likes are there, I think that can continue to happen within that broader framework. So my answer is very general, but it should not be a significant impediment if it were to be such a case. And so that's the other thing. And the last point I want to make is that since the GFC, there's a massive increase in what we call the dollar funding market. And the dollar funding market has become so important, and the role of the dollar in financing emerging markets and frontier markets, that the role of the international community and supranational institutions have become even more important, because now as the tide turns, we are seeing the appreciation of the dollar leading to large outflows of capital from emerging market countries. So this is a broader issue that also needs to be tackled within the context of the international financial institutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Goswami. And in the interest of time, we move to the last question in the panel discussion. That is to Dr. Gunigundo. Most of the economies, even in the regional context, are adopting policy actions in a swift and aggressive way to protect macroeconomic stability. What factors have prompted such policy actions, particularly in relation to foreign exchange considerations? Dr. Gunigundo.
Thank you very much. You must be referring to the increasing aggressiveness of central banks around the world in tightening monetary policy by way of bigger increases in their policy rates. Many central banks, including the US Fed, thought at the end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021 that inflation was transitory. The global economy was just beginning to recover, and so demand was rather modest worldwide. It turned out it was a misplaced optimism because oil prices began to skyrocket, and because of the pandemic, supply chains remained in disarray. I think Lauren Summer pointed this out as much. What abetted the supply-driven inflationary situation was, of course, the inordinately high liquidity released to the system by excessively easy monetary policy across the global economies. They brought down their policy rates to near zero, as in the US and in many parts of Europe. Some central banks, including those of the Philippines and Sri Lanka, even loaned huge amount of money to the government, which was limited by weak revenues but increasing expenditure due to the pandemic and the demand to sustain economic recovery and growth. Unless central banks demonstrate their seriousness to check inflation, inflation expectations would continue to be disanchored. The urgency comes from the large differential between their high inflation rates and their low policy rates. Unless they do it in big amounts, more than 25 basis points, like 75 basis points, as what the US Fed did 2 weeks ago, and continuously for the rest of the year, many central banks would find themselves significantly behind the curve. Monetary policy works with long and variable lag. Okay? A more aggressive policy stance could help monetary policy catch up. Interest rates, therefore, have to be set appropriately aggressive because one, inflation will remain high and it could upset macroeconomic stability, as high inflation could also reduce economic growth through lower private consumption and investment. And two, unless inflation is arrested, external competitiveness might be affected in the process, and the domestic currency could face an additional pressure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jimlindo. I think we had come to an end of the panel discussion, and we had some interesting ideas and thoughts shared by all the panel members. In the interest of time, now we need to move into the final segment of the webinar, which is the questions raised by the general public who are participants in this webinar. So I would like to pose the first question to Dr. Vignaraja. Usually when a country seeks assistance from agencies like IMF, they will impose conditions and propose reforms while granting a facility. How a country can deal with the internal risks arising after implementation of such reforms post granting the facility? Dr. Vignaraja, any ideas?
Thank you. Yes, for sure. I mean, the IMF program for Sri Lanka and the content is probably no secret. I mean, if you looked at the previous program, you'll get some good clues. Taxes will probably have to go up. Expenditure will have to come down. The exchange rate will have to be a bit freer. State-owned enterprises will have to be looked at. Utility pricing and subsidies, which have already now been unshackled a bit, may be more realistic, and so on. I mean, these measures usually have an element of austerity on these, right? And that's the kind of standard pattern, right? And will be, growth reducing, shall we say, at least in the short run. Now, we have to counter this with two things, I believe. The first is we have to have very strong cash transfers to deal with the impact on the poor, right? Because they are the ones who will often bear the brunt of these types of measures. And I mean, particularly in the case of fuel and food subsidies, which are important, we have to make sure. And I think there's an interesting debate about whether the transfers should be targeted or whether they should be unconditional. I think that means testing isn't so good in Sri Lanka. And therefore, I would suggest universal cash transfers. And for the richer people, they could be clawed back through the tax system. And that may be one mechanism to try to deal with this issue on poverty. The second brief element is really about a structural adjustment program for inclusive growth. And we talked about the financial sector, but it also means, cutting red tape. It means promoting exports. It means dealing with barriers to foreign investment. It means trying to get the growth side going. So I think both of these things are going to be important as a complement to the IMF program, which will undoubtedly bring some austerity with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Raja. Then we have plenty of questions there, and maybe we'll limit the answering to about 2 minutes, if that would be fine with the panelists. Let me move on to the next question, which is being posed by it's with regard to the SMEs, which I would like to forward it to Dr. Goswami. In the current context of the foreign exchange crisis in Sri Lanka, how do you think the affected SMEs will face the challenges posed by such crises? And what advice would you give them going forward in terms of changing business models, funding models, and business lines, and so on? How have countries with similar issues grappled with this situation? Dr. Goswami.
Thank you for that. Very quickly, again, I think it's a question of first is a question of liquidity, and then it's a question of capital, basically, in terms of being able to, keep, not to go bankrupt. In other words, so I think an important issue there is for an assessment of how the SMEs, which SMEs are sort of facing a liquidity crisis versus a solvency crisis. That's an important assessment to make. But of course, access to financing and this liquidity to solvency is a very difficult one. Access to financing is going to be crucial under current circumstances, especially the SMEs that are exposed to foreign exchange liabilities. They are likely to see their liabilities in Sri Lankan rupees go up significantly, especially if they are not, naturally hedged through exports. Of course, what we know now is that the economy has come to a very significant halt. So none of this activity is probably taking place. So in that sense, I think it will, there has to be more private sector capital injection through external, maybe injection of capital or the likes, given domestic resources are going to be limited. So one way would be is to seek for external, development finance like the IFCs and the likes to come in to provide some seed funding or some financing to be able to, for some of these SMEs to continue to operate. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Goswami. And I would like to pose the next question to Mr. Jayalat. Mr. Jayalat, should the country look to invoice regional trade in regional currencies to build more resilience?
Yeah, I think that's a very good idea. I think it's we can transact in regional currencies provided there's currencies available. And one thing is that I doubt that whether that will eliminate the crisis that we have encountered completely, because anyway, it's not printable by the country itself. And so anyway, you have to have that appropriate safeguards in place before that. It's good idea that more currencies come in and regional currencies trade in. We have a similar arrangement here, that Asian Clearing Union, which is looking into a type of arrangement that involves regional currencies, but it's not completely transacting in regional currency itself, but it's somewhere there. But we may have the advantage of using that because we will be able to use the currencies that they are familiar to us and know the domestic currency itself, the transactions. But as solution or remedy to this crisis, I doubt whether they provide any kind of immediate solution for this one. Of course, this is something that we can look into going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Jayalat. And there is one question which I believe should forward it to Dr. Vinigundo. It is in relation to foreign remittances. Now, you take the Sri Lankan banks, they have been traditionally relying on worker remittances along with export proceeds to meet their foreign currency obligations. And of course, with the current crisis, that has turned out to be a major problem. And now, of course, with the exchange rate differentials between the formal and grey markets, which has started to widen, and the remittances have declined and FX liquidity has more or less evaporated. So that has put added stress on the forex operations of the banking sector. So the question is, I'm sure Philippines also is a country that has a large quantum of remittances coming in, particularly worker remittances as well. So what long-term strategies could be employed to increase inward remittances through formal channels? And how important is the consistency of such strategies to gradually build the depleted official reserves of the country in the medium to long term? Dr. Ginigundo?
Okay. The Philippines receives about $30 billion in foreign remittances every year. That was the question that we addressed probably 15 years ago. How to bring in these remittances through the formal banking channel. So the way we did it was to consult with the banks themselves. And we required the banks precisely to post in their in prominent places, in their branches, especially abroad, their remittance charges. Well, it's a question of remittance charges. So our foreign workers can simply canvass. They can simply shop for the lowest remittance charge. That's one. Second, we also asked the banks to consider giving them more competitive rates, okay, when they remit from abroad to the Philippines. The way we did it was not just to require the banks or to mandate the banks to charge lower fees. We used our own gross settlement payment system run by the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas and charge them 5 pesos per remittance. And then they can charge only 50 pesos instead of the usual 100 to 200 pesos. So I think in that way, we were able to bring in more remittances into the formal banking channel. It is important that we work through market-based solutions. That's one. Second, it is also important to realize that the amount of remittances is not just a function of how efficient and how cost-effective remittances through the banking channels are. It's also a question of the amount of monthly salaries or wages these foreign workers earn abroad. So, but in these times, we are seeing some slowdown in the global economic activities. So we are also seeing some slowdown in terms of remittances from abroad to the Philippines. But it looks like 2022 may be a lot more favorable compared to the last 2 years of the pandemic. We are seeing a restoration of the $31 billion every year. So I think those are my my comments to that question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ginigundo. I think there's a related question also, which I would like to pose to you. What are the measures taken against to mitigate the Undial Hawala practices, which hinders the informal inward remittances? The Hawala practices, I wonder whether it has any impact on the Philippines inward remittance.
The Hawala system was existent in the Philippines many years ago. But because of this market-based solution and the cooperation that we solicited from the banks, and the banks cooperated with the regulators, the Hawala system was effectively minimized and later on eliminated.
Thank you, Dr. Ginigundo. I think we have come to the end of the public questioning session, and this is the last segment of the webinar. It will be a wrap-up question where I would like to ask the panelists to limit your response to 1 minute. The question is, in your view, what additional measures or policy reforms should Sri Lanka take to restore the country from the current crisis and ensure long-term stability? We will start off with Mr. Jayala.
Thank you, Mr. Tasim. I would say that fiscal rule to ensure that fiscal discipline is of paramount importance. Then the central bank or the monetary policy independence to make sure that all monetary policy actions are taken place to ensure the inflation is kept under check and independently of fiscal discipline. What we have experienced is, in most cases, the fiscal dominance. But with the discipline and independence, it's central bank will be able to ensure that inflation is kept under check. Of course, this should come together with the accountability. And the next one is the economics over politics, which I mentioned earlier. So whatever the policy that brought up by the socio-political environments need to be analyzed and well thought through during the early stage before its implementation. It's to make sure that they are sustainable. And so those are the few thoughts that I'm having. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jalan. Over to Dr. Vignaraja.
Thank you, Chair. So your question, if I got it, was that you wanted us to say what sort of reforms we need to do. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. The measures or the policy reforms that Sri Lanka should take to restore the country.
So once we have stabilized the economy through an IMF program, or while we're doing that, we need to ensure we put in structural reforms. And those reforms really need to shift the economy towards a more market-oriented system, away from the public sector domination that we have at present. And I think we really have to also look at a safety net for the poor while we're doing that transition. And in this transition, we really have to get serious about raising price, quality, and delivery to global standards. And I think if we do all of this, I'm fairly confident Sri Lanka can come out of this with reasonable growth in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Over to Mr. Goswami.
Very short one. I would say that reduce in the same light as Dr. Ganeshan has mentioned, reduce the footprint of the public sector's involvement in the economy and increase and incentivize the private sector's involvement in the economy through various means, so that innovation, productivity can be fostered. That would be my
Thank you.
1 cent.
And Dr. Girigundo.
Yeah, thank you very much. What I would like Sri Lanka to do is to demonstrate its commitment to good governance and structural reforms, which have the effect of future-proofing the Sri Lankan economy. It would have something to do with additional reforms on digitalization of the Sri Lankan economy and government. Climate change has to be incorporated in policy choices. Green finance should be promoted. That should establish Sri Lanka's reliability to maintain sound macroeconomic stability. That should also inspire greater confidence among foreign and domestic investors alike that investing in Sri Lanka is worth it. Some kind of a unity pact can also be signed by both the executive and the legislative branches of government, the parliament, to ensure the people and the market that no less than the whole of government is brought upon this latest economic challenge to Sri Lanka since its independence, I think in 1948. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Girigundo. I think with that, we have completed all the sessions in the webinar today. Let me thank the panelists once again, Dr. Girigundo, Dr. Vignaraja, Dr. Goswami, and Mr. Jayalat for sharing your valuable insights, interesting thoughts, and also sharing your experience with us at this webinar today. And it was a pleasure and honor for me to have moderated this session with such an eminent panel. I think we have finished on time, sharp at 4:30 Sri Lanka time. And I hand over the sessions to the Director of Center for Banking Studies, Dimuthu. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tazim, and good evening to all of you. It was indeed a very interesting and productive seminar and was an absolute pleasure to listen to this discussion. At the same time, we, the Center for Banking Studies, is delighted for organizing this high-level seminar with the patronage of leading experts and practitioners in the region to discuss past currency crises and how successful those governments and the regulators were in resolving the same. It is our hope that the discussions stemmed from this seminar will extend the theoretical and empirical literature on currency crisis and contribute to policy discussions on resolving the issues that our country is faced with right now. This was the sole objective of the webinar today, and I hope the audience too was able to enhance their understanding of the issues experienced by other countries in the past and the applicability of the same to our context. At the conclusion of today's event, let me take this opportunity to extend my sincere gratitude to all the eminent speakers, Dr. Ginigundo, Dr. Vignaraja, Dr. Goswami, Mr. Jayalat, and Mr. Tazim for accepting our invitation and sharing their insightful thoughts today with us to add value to this important event. So thank you very much, sir. Also, I wish to thank the governor and the top management of the central bank for supporting us to proceed with our proposal to conduct this webinar on a timely topic. This is one in a series of webinars organized by the Center for Banking Studies to create a platform for experienced speakers and panelists to make their viewpoints. As observed in most recent seminars, this high-level seminar too had an overwhelming participation. So I wish to thank all of you who listened to the panelists and took part very actively in the discussions by raising various questions. Also, for those who missed it fully or partially, we would be uploading this seminar proceedings to the CBSL YouTube channel shortly. We, the Center for Banking Studies, will organize similar public events on time-relevant topics in future as well. So please keep in touch with us. Thank you very much once again and have a pleasant evening.